A darkness fell over Tehran that no one expected. 14 million people plunged into complete blackout in a matter of seconds. Not a single light on the horizon, not a signal on cell phones, nothing. Just the oppressive silence of a city that suddenly lost its pulse. This was not a technical failure. This was not an accident. This was military strategy in its purest and most devastating form. And Florida Governor Ron DeSantis just stood before cameras with a message that should make every American pay attention. If it happened to them, it can happen to us. The question is not if our grid could go down the same way. The question is when and whether we will be ready when that moment comes. DeSantis did not mince words during his emergency security briefing in Tallahassee. He called the Tehran blackout a dress rehearsal for threats that could materialize on American soil within months or years. The governor pointed to Florida's unique vulnerabilities. 22 million residents dependent on air conditioning in a subtropical climate, massive desalination plants keeping coastal cities supplied with fresh water, and an electrical infrastructure that looks remarkably similar to the one that just failed catastrophically in the Iranian capital. The parallels are not coincidental. Modern cities, whether in the Middle East or North America, share the same fundamental weakness: centralized power grids with single points of failure that can be exploited by anyone with the right weapons and the will to use them. DeSantis made it clear that ignoring this reality is not just negligent, it is potentially suicidal for a nation that has grown comfortable assuming the lights will always turn back on. What exactly happened over Tehran gives us the blueprint we need to understand. Approximately 150 combat aircraft launched a coordinated strike using around 120 precision-guided munitions. But here is what separates this from conventional bombing campaigns. They did not target military bases directly. They did not carpet bomb neighborhoods. They went after transmission towers, electrical substations, critical connection nodes, and the high-voltage lines feeding power into the capital from surrounding provinces. Multiple zones across the city lost power simultaneously. The result was surgical, calculated, and terrifyingly effective. 14 million people went dark not because of overwhelming firepower, but because someone understood exactly which dominoes to knock over to collapse the entire system. The images that emerged showed specific damage to infrastructure, not craters from massive explosives. This was not about destruction. This was about disruption, and disruption achieved with clinical precision. Now consider the American electrical grid. 70% of the infrastructure supporting our power network is more than 25 years old. Critical substations operate without redundancy, meaning if one goes down, entire regions can cascade into darkness. Our largest cities concentrate millions of people in areas utterly dependent on continuous electrical supply. New York, Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago. Each one a potential tale of one waiting for the right push. DeSantis has been pointing to studies that should terrify anyone paying attention. An electromagnetic pulse weapon detonated at high altitude, a coordinated cyber attack on 10 substations simultaneously, or distributed physical sabotage across 20 states could each trigger a collapse that makes the Tehran blackout look like a local power outage. And the enemies capable of executing such attacks are not theoretical. They are studying the same case we are, learning the same lessons, and building the same capabilities. Within hours of the blackout, Tehran's financial system ground to a halt, ATMs went dead, point-of-sale terminals stopped working, electronic fund transfers became impossible, but the cascade did not stop there. Elevators in high-rise buildings trapped residents between floors. Traffic signals failed, turning major intersections into chaos. Most critically, electric water pumps shut down across the city. Millions of people suddenly had no access to fresh drinking water. Hospitals switched to backup generators, knowing their fuel supplies would last days at best. Supermarkets lost refrigeration. Communication networks collapsed, creating an information vacuum where rumors spread faster than facts. Now imagine Manhattan without power for 72 hours. Imagine the looting when alarm systems go silent. Imagine the panic when 311 million Americans realize that everything they depend on, from water to food to medical care, flows through a system that can be shut off like a light switch. The military target buried beneath all this civilian suffering reveals the true genius of the strategy. East of Tehran sits a sprawling underground complex that has been a cornerstone of missile development programs for years. This subterranean city, protected by meters of reinforced concrete and buried deep enough to withstand conventional bunker busters, should theoretically be impregnable. But it has one fatal flaw: it depends entirely on the electrical grid above ground. Without external power, ventilation systems fail. Oxygen levels drop rapidly in sealed underground spaces. Toxic gases accumulate. Industrial pumps that prevent flooding stop working. And perhaps most devastating for a military installation, the servers and radar systems that represent billions in investment start overheating. Modern defense technology generates tremendous heat. Without active cooling, these systems burn out in minutes. The complex went from operational headquarters to a concrete tomb, not because anyone dropped a bomb on it directly, but because someone turned off the switch that kept it alive. American military installations face identical vulnerabilities. NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain Complex, NSA's underground data centers, and nuclear command bunkers all require massive amounts of continuous electrical power. Yes, they have backup generators. Yes, they have fuel reserves. But here is the uncomfortable truth that DeSantis keeps hammering home. Military-grade radar systems and data centers consume fuel at rates that exhaust diesel supplies in 6 to 12 hours under full operational load. Studies from the Department of Energy confirm that 87% of critical installations have backup power for less than 48 hours. And here is the logistical nightmare. Resupplying those generators during an active attack is essentially impossible. Fuel trucks become targets. Supply lines become kill zones. The backup systems that are supposed to save us buy time measured in hours, not days, and certainly not weeks. When ventilation fails in underground military complexes, personnel have limited time before the air becomes unbreathable. When drainage pumps stop, tunnels flood. When cooling systems shut down, the technology that cost billions to develop becomes expensive scrap metal. Tehran lost its air surveillance capability, its command and control networks, and its ability to coordinate defensive responses, all because the power went out. The radar systems went blind. The communication networks that connect field commanders to central command fell silent. For 48 hours, a nation with significant military capabilities was essentially paralyzed, unable to see threats coming and unable to coordinate responses to the threats it could identify. American forces facing a similar scenario would find themselves in the same nightmare, eyes closed, ears blocked, voice silenced. The internet blackout that accompanied the power failure created a secondary catastrophe that often gets overlooked. Command and control in modern militaries depends on integrated networks carrying real-time data from sensors to decision makers. When those networks go dark, the entire intelligence apparatus grinds to a halt. Radars cannot transmit what they detect. Satellites cannot downlink imagery. Field units cannot receive orders. The nuclear chain of command, which requires continuous communication between the executive authority and launch facilities, faces potential disruption. Without power, cabinet members become isolated, generals lose access to real-time intelligence, and the ability to manage any kind of crisis evaporates. DeSantis posed the question that keeps defense analysts awake at night. What happens to our nuclear response capability if the communication networks coordinating that response simply stop functioning? But beyond military paralysis lies something perhaps even more dangerous: psychological collapse. The Tehran blackout shattered the population's confidence in their government's ability to protect them. When the lights went out in the capital, the implicit promise of security died with them. Military and political elites descended into paranoia, suspecting leaks and internal betrayal. This internal suspicion, this fear of informants and collaborators, can be as destructive as any external attack. The society begins to consume itself from within. And American society, DeSantis warns, is far less prepared for such a shock than populations that have lived through sanctions and hardship. FEMA studies suggest that 89% of Americans do not have supplies to sustain themselves for even 1 week without external support. 3 days without power could trigger civil unrest that makes recovery exponentially harder. The fragility is not just in the infrastructure. It is in the collective psychology of a population that has never had to imagine life without constant electrical power. The threats facing American infrastructure come from multiple directions. State actors like China have demonstrated sophisticated cyber capabilities through incidents that compromised major systems. Russia's doctrine of hybrid warfare explicitly includes energy infrastructure sabotage as a primary tool. North Korea has explored high-altitude electromagnetic pulse weapons that could be delivered via satellite or long-range missile. And after experiencing the Tehran attack, there is every reason to believe that retaliatory planning includes asymmetric strikes on infrastructure rather than conventional military targets. Non-state actors present equally serious risks. Domestic terrorism studies show that coordinated attacks on just 4 critical substations could trigger regional blackouts. Criminal organizations have already demonstrated willingness to sabotage infrastructure for profit or leverage. Ransomware attacks on energy companies are no longer theoretical. They have already happened, and they will happen again with greater sophistication. The doctrine of modern warfare has fundamentally shifted. Occupying territory is a 20th century strategy that costs tremendous resources and yields diminishing returns. 21st century warfare focuses on systemic collapse, attacking not frontline troops but the arteries of energy, communication networks, and logistical supply chains that keep modern states functioning. The enemy does not need to defeat your army if they can starve it of fuel, blind it with communication blackouts, and isolate it from command authority. This is the lesson Tehran teaches, and it is the lesson that adversaries around the world are studying with great interest. DeSantis calls it the intelligent siege. You do not storm the castle, you cut off its water supply and wait for it to surrender from within. When central command loses power, the ripple effects extend far beyond national borders. Regional proxies and allied forces that depend on direction, funding, and intelligence from headquarters suddenly find themselves orphaned. Without communication, they cannot receive orders. Without functioning financial networks, they cannot access operational funds. Without intelligence feeds, they operate blind. American military installations scattered across multiple continents depend on continuous communication with central command facilities. If those facilities lose power and their backup systems fail, 70-plus bases could find themselves effectively disconnected during a critical window when adversaries might choose to strike. The vulnerability is not just domestic, it is global. Current protective measures are woefully inadequate compared to the scale of the threat. Approximately 100 critical substations out of 55,000 total have received hardening against physical attack. There is virtually zero electromagnetic pulse protection for civilian grid infrastructure. Funding for grid modernization receives roughly $2 billion annually while overall defense spending exceeds $800 billion. The math does not add up. Most state emergency response plans were written before 2015 and do not account for the sophisticated threats we now face. The assumption that the grid will always recover quickly enough to prevent catastrophic social breakdown is exactly that, an assumption, not a tested reality. 3 scenarios deserve serious consideration. First, a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse from a nuclear weapon detonated 400 kilometers above the continent could disable electronics across half the country without any physical destruction. Recovery time, years, not months. Second, a coordinated cyberattack hitting 10 major substations simultaneously could create a cascading overload that brings down the regional grid. Recovery time, weeks to months, depending on the availability of replacement transformers that are not stockpiled in sufficient numbers. Third, distributed physical sabotage by 20 small cells attacking transformers in 20 different states simultaneously. Law enforcement and National Guard cannot be everywhere at once. Replacement parts for specialized high-voltage transformers often have lead times measured in months, and there is no strategic reserve. Recovery time, months, potentially longer if attacks continue during the repair phase. Here's the question that almost no one in authority wants to answer directly. How many casualties would result from 30 days without electrical power across major population centers? Studies examining long-term grid failure suggest that within 1 year, 90% of the population could perish from starvation, disease, and violence if power is not restored. Food distribution networks collapse. Water treatment fails. Medical facilities exhaust their backup capacity. Law and order break down as desperation sets in. This is not speculation. This is the logical outcome of a society built entirely on the assumption of cheap, abundant, and reliable electricity suddenly losing that foundation. Congressional hearings avoid this topic because the implications are too catastrophic to process, much less plan for adequately. The lessons from Tehran are stark and unforgiving. Centralized infrastructure creates single points of failure that can be exploited with relatively modest military resources. Redundancy and distributed systems cost more upfront but represent the difference between resilience and collapse when attacks come. Propaganda and official denials do not restore power or feed populations. What happened was a warning shot, a demonstration of capability and a preview of tactics that can be replicated against any modern nation that has failed to harden its critical infrastructure. Adversaries are not ignoring this case study. They are incorporating it into their planning, identifying vulnerabilities in their targets, and preparing to execute similar operations when strategic calculus dictates. The window to act is finite. The question is not whether such attacks are possible. The question is whether we will take the threat seriously before we become the next case study. Governor DeSantis ended his briefing with a challenge that should resonate in every state capital and every federal office. Florida is committing $500 million to energy infrastructure resilience. Other states need to follow. Federal legislation needs to prioritize grid security with funding that matches the scale of the threat. But beyond government action, individual preparedness cannot be ignored. Every household should have 2 weeks minimum of water, food, and essential medications. Personal generators and solar backup systems are not luxuries. They are insurance policies. Communication plans that do not depend on cell networks or internet connectivity need to be established. The assumption that government will arrive in time to prevent catastrophe is dangerous. People need to prepare as if help will not come, because in a scenario like Tehran, help might not be able to reach everyone who needs it. The comparison is unavoidable. Tehran went dark, and 14 million people experienced what happens when the invisible systems holding civilization together suddenly fail. America, with 330 million people concentrated in cities just as dependent on continuous power, faces the exact same vulnerabilities with even less preparation among the general population. The grid is down is not just a headline. It is a preview of what happens when nations ignore obvious weaknesses until enemies exploit them. One choice remains: act now with the urgency this threat deserves, or wait and try to explain later why we saw the warning and did nothing. Tehran gave us the playbook. The only question is whether we have the wisdom to read it and the courage to act on what it teaches before someone uses that same playbook against us.